From Lagos, the nation's commercial capital, this is the News at 10. Live from Channels Television. Reporting tonight, Amarachi Ubani.
Eid Mubarak, good evening, welcome. Muslims the world over hold low-key Eid al-Fitr celebrations to mark the end of 30 days fasting period of Ramadan amid the coronavirus pandemic. President Muhammadu Buhari and his family hold Eid al-Fitr prayers at home. The president asks Nigerian farmers to scale up production for food sufficiency in the absence of importation, demands strict adherence to NCDC guidelines. Kano and Katsina residents defy directive against religious gatherings and physical distancing as they hold open-air Ramadan Eid prayers. Southeast governors reject IGP's plan on community policing, ask him to revert to their original agreement. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces trial for alleged bribery, fraud and breach of trust, days after he began a new term in office.
بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا
Today, Muslims in Nigeria join their counterparts around the world to mark this year's Eid al-Fitr, marking the end of the 30-day fasting month period of Ramadan. But the usual festivities that accompany the annual celebration is missing as many countries take measures to curb the spread of the coronavirus pandemic, including the suspension of Eid prayers, outdoor festivals and other celebratory events. Eid al-Fitr means festival of breaking the fast, and celebrations would normally begin depending on the sighting of the moon. Traditionally, Eid is celebrated for 3 days in all Muslim-majority countries. The fight against coronavirus is still on, and governments in many nations continue to step up restrictions that will help curtail the spread of the disease, with an appeal to citizens, including Muslims, to abide by all necessary guidelines for their safety. Here in Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari and members of his family observed the Eid al-Fitr prayers at the presidential villa in Abuja. It's an unusual celebration because of the COVID-19 pandemic and guidelines on social distancing. To lead by example, the president and his family complied with the physical distancing directive by the NCDC and the Ministry of Health to guard against the spread of the virus. The president also has a message for the Nigerian farmers, and it's for them to help grow more food to sustain the nation in this trying period of the pandemic.
It's an unusual Eid al-Fitr celebration across the world, and likewise at the presidency, as the first family, led by President Muhammadu Buhari, assembled for the Eid prayers within the villa premises. As expected, the gathering is limited to less than 20, with physical distancing clearly observed. The chief imam of the State House Central Mosque leads the session. The lesson of the Ramadan season is not missing. So also are the guidelines by the NCDC. After the 2 Rakat Eid prayers, President Buhari seizes the moment to ask farmers and indeed Nigerians to wake up to the reality of the global pandemic by going back to the farm, since importation is nearly impossible.
I hope the rainy season will be bountiful. We'll get a lot of food. I wish the farmers will go and stay in the land so that we can produce what we need sufficient, so that we don't have to import. In any case, we don't have any money to import food, so we must produce what we are going to eat.
The president also wants Nigerians to observe health advisories in order to stop the spread of the coronavirus.
They can see that COVID-19 has reduced us, when I say us, both the developed and developing country to the same level. In fact, we have less casualties than they have. So it is a very frightening development, and I advise Nigerians to be very careful to take the advice from the Ministry of Health. The Minister of Health has been doing very well, speaking and educating people generally. So Nigerians, we should be very careful.
For the wife of the president, Aisha Buhari, the Ramadan season has afforded everyone an opportunity to reflect on the current global pandemic. She, however, prays for speedy recovery for those who are bedridden as a result of the disease.
Despite the unusual circumstances we found ourselves, and I wish Nigerian women could follow the rules and regulations of the Federal Ministry of Health and also the NCDC regulations. And for those that lost their lives as victims of COVID-19, may the Almighty Allah forgive their sins and grant them Al-Jannatul Firdaus. And for those that are sick, we wish them speedy recovery, and also we pray for the end of COVID-19 throughout the world.
Leading by example, the president has advised against social gatherings and interstate travel as part of measures to stop the spread of COVID-19, in addition to observing the Eid prayers at home.
Away from the presidency, other Muslim faithful across the country also observed Eid al-Fitr prayers, particularly in some northern states, but with disregard to the physical distancing directive. They gathered at different prayer grounds where a few persons observed the precautions. Our next report looks at adherence to this directive and how the day was celebrated in some northern states.
Eid al-Fitr, or the festival of breaking the fast, marks the end of the month-long dawn-to-sunset Ramadan fast. It's characterized by a salat and 2 rakats, usually performed in an open field or a large hall with a large congregation. But not this year. Due to health concerns brought on by the coronavirus, the fields and halls are empty in most parts of the country, with many messages to the Muslim faithful sent online. In the nation's capital, Abuja, the chief imam of Al-Habiyya Mosque in Guzape is appealing to Nigerians to imbibe the lessons of Ramadan by reaching out to poor and vulnerable persons. In Kano, northwest Nigeria, hundreds of Muslim faithful came out for the Eid al-Fitr prayers at the Central Mosque Eid prayer ground.
While people are conducting their prayers, we urge them to follow the protocol of COVID so that we continue to curtail the spread of this coronavirus.
In Bauchi State, the prayer was held amid an early morning downpour at the Bauchi Central Mosque instead of the usual Eid prayer ground as a measure to control the crowd. There was strict observance to social distancing rules inside the mosque.
Our formula is working. What we have seen is minimal or the maximum social distancing that we can exercise. And that's why at every gathering I make sure social distancing is done.
In Kogi State, North Central Nigeria, at the Lokoja Township Stadium Eid prayer ground, Governor Yahya Bello has charged the people of the state to be more vigilant in order to resist anybody who might want to import any form of infectious disease into the state.
Our people heed to our advice. They took to instructions. They observe all the necessary protocols in line with the world best practices. And today, we are safe, we are hale and hearty in Kogi State.
In Borno State, northeast Nigeria, the Eid prayer held at the Ramat Square, a large field with capacity for tens of thousands of persons. The state governor, Professor Babagana Zulum, joined the rest of the Muslims in the state for Eid prayers, Salah celebrations are relatively low-key across northern Nigeria this year. But the need to keep to social distancing and wearing of face masks is still very low. More engagement at the grassroots level using religious leaders will go a long way to get communities to buy into the need to flatten the curve of the coronavirus in northern Nigeria.
And in the southern part of the country, where religious gatherings are totally banned in most states, restricted access into prayer grounds are granted in others. Muslim faithful gathered in Bayelsa, where they also did not entirely adhere to physical distancing directives.
Members of the Muslim community in Anambra State hold their Eid prayers at different mosques in Awka, the state capital. The glamour and fanfare that always follow the gathering tuned down, but the essence of the day is not lost.
It is now important that everybody should learn the lesson of the fasting of the month of Ramadan by being closer to God and fearing God.
Muslims in Bayelsa State gather at the sport complex in Yenegua to observe the Eid prayers. Shoulder to shoulder, they pray with no sign of physical distancing.
The social distance is what we have been maintaining, because I'm also a member of the COVID committee in Bayelsa State. So we tried our best to see how people can distance themselves.
The story is different in Ogun State. The popular prayer ground in the state capital is locked with zero human activity. In Oyo State, the Eid ground in Agodi, the Sabo Central Mosque, and other places where people would have gathered on a day like this are deserted. But people are seen dressed for the day, celebrating with their families. Also in the state, the Are Musulumi of Yoruba land, Edo and Delta states, is appealing to the federal government to consider reopening places of worship.
I want the government to look into staying in house, don't go to mosque or don't go to the church. We can't do this thing by ourselves. It's only God intervention can relieve us from this pandemic.
In Lagos, there's a semblance of celebration as well, despite the quiet street activities. At the residence of the Dairos, a devout Muslim family, the celebration is restricted to their household. They say they have enough to be thankful for.
Unlike before, we will have gone, and in fact, maybe we will still be around parks now, where the kids are always eager. The only opportunity to have at going out is during this kind of period. They go to parks, amusement parks, they have rides, they play around, and they feel the real import of the celebration. But here we are.
If there is any other word we could use to describe what it has actually caused, it is more of low-key.
Eid al-Fitr is traditionally celebrated with mosque prayers and family treats, but with the global health challenge posed by COVID-19, a precautionary ban on religious gathering is in place to reduce community spread of the virus.
While Muslims celebrate the Eid al-Fitr, it appears the day is not just for them alone. Some Christians took advantage of the lifting of the ban on religious activities to worship in their churches after a long time. Christians in Kano and Bayelsa State say it's also nice to gather again after a long break caused by COVID-19.
A charged atmosphere of praise and worship in Kano. Like every other church in the state, these Christians are happy to be back together after 5 weeks of lockdown and ban on religious activities, which is part of measures to combat the spread of COVID-19 in the state.
The governor of Kano State called the Christian leaders into a meeting in the government house and said that there was a need to reopen the churches because he reiterated his belief in the fact that actually at such a time like this, we need prayers.
While they're happy to be together, they are not unaware of the precautions that kept them at home for the past 5 weeks.
It feels good. After 5 weeks of the lockdown, we are in church today. I'm so happy.
For everyone that want to enter into the church must wash his hand and sanitize. And then we also keep a social distancing in the church so that everyone that is coming will not be contaminated. And we believe that no one will be contaminated.
By now, we should start thinking post-COVID-19 because there's going to be life after this season. So you should make plans to what your life is going to be like.
The atmosphere is the same in Cross River State, South Nigeria. Unlike Kanu, churches and mosques have been under lock and key for more than 13 weeks, a decision considered not favorable to everyone.
Very disturbing is the fact that, see, you open markets, you open other places where people are crowded, where they cannot even maintain orderliness, where you cannot control orderliness. Such places are open and then you keep the churches locked. It's disturbing.
We have only accepted people today as a test case. We have announced already that by next Sunday, bearing the government's instructions, we will be running 2, 3, 4, 5 services.
So far, Cross River State is yet to record any COVID-19 case. The governor, Professor Ben Ayade, insists he will do everything possible to ensure that that situation remains the same.
In part 2, after the break, we have more on the Ramadan celebration and we'll be joined by an Islamic cleric, Imam Abdurrahman Ahmad. Plus, Kaduna health workers warning strike paralyzes activities in public hospitals. Stay with us. Welcome back. If it has joined us, you're watching the news at 10, coming to you live from Lagos. A reminder of our top stories. President Muhammadu Buhari and, Muslims all over the world hold low-key Eid al-Fitr celebrations to mark end of 30-day fasting period for Ramadan amid the COVID-19 pandemic. President Muhammadu Buhari and his family hold Eid al-Fitr prayers at home, asks Nigerian farmers to scale up production for food sufficiency in the absence of importation, demands strict adherence to NCDC guidelines. Kano and Katsina residents defy directive against religious gatherings and physical distancing as they hold open-air Ramadan Eid prayers. Southeast governors reject IGP's plan on community policing, ask him to revert to their original agreement. And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces trial for alleged bribery, fraud, and breach of trust days after he began a new term in office. Our website, channelstv.com, has more information on our top stories and others. Subscribe and watch Channels Television's live stream on YouTube and other social media platforms using your mobile device browser, or download the Channels TV app for Android and iOS devices from their respective stores. You can also watch us via your smart TV platforms on Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, and Roku. And now to some of the stories that you sent in. Let's begin with this video from Abeokuta, the state capital, showing these youth service corps members whom our eyewitness describes. Okay, we know who they are. They're sensitizing residents about the global pandemic, COVID-19. The corps members are emphasizing the need for hand washing, social distancing, the use of face masks as some precautions against the disease. Our next image is from Kara Abattoir in Ogbomosho, Oyo State, and it's showing these traders who the eyewitness accuses of flouting the safety precaution of face masks and social distancing. He wants more done in that regard. Here's our final picture tonight, an image of the innovative minds of students of the Federal Polytechnic Nekede in Imo State. The students, according to our eyewitness, constructed a pedal-operated hand-washing machine and another solar-powered automated hand-washing machine. They have plans for mass production. Thanks for sending in those pictures, and please keep them coming. We continue our focus on celebrating the Eid under COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, ease of restrictions and a curfew. We've been joined now on the news at 10 by Imam Abdurrahman Ahmad to look at the celebration of Eid this year. Thank you for joining us on the news at 10, and Eid Mubarak to you.
Thank you.
How does it feel, celebrating this Eid amidst the global health pandemic, the fact that, faithful can't gather together to worship together, and I'm sure lots of people were probably looking forward to meeting other family members, friends, and colleagues. It's just to celebrate.
Well, I must confess it feels very odd indeed, and majority of Muslims would not have witnessed this in their lifetimes, because probably the last time this happens will be during the 1918-1919 Spanish flu pandemic. So for a lifetime we have been gathering during Eid, and this is unique. As painful, as odd as it appears, well, it is in the best interests of all of us. Islam being a very practical religion, we already have provisions for all of these, because the Prophet ﷺ said, when there is a pandemic or an epidemic, the priority should be the preservation of life, and people should stay in their houses. In fact, even in less serious situations, like in situations of rain and flooding, you are advised, in fact, you are enjoined to pray at home. So it is against this background that it's relatively easier for the Muslim community to cope with it, as odd as it is.
Yeah, and you did see that some of your other Muslim faithful celebrating in the northern part of the country. There were a number of congregations that held. What are your thoughts on that, based on what you have just said about people observing certain restrictions, even when there's just even a small crisis?
You see, it's quite unfortunate. It's quite unfortunate. They should not be put down to Islam itself, but to an interpretation, a minority, fringe interpretation of the text. I can tell you for sure that the Nigerian Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs, which is the apex body of Islamic organizations and the Muslim community in Nigeria, has issued directive to the fact that the Eid should be suspended because of the pandemic. And the Fatwa Arm, that's the Fatwa Committee of the Nigerian Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs, the Fatwa Council of the Jamaat Nasr al-Islam, had also issued similar fatwa. Fatwa are, religious rulings, as guiding Muslims what they should do in particular circumstances. So there is adequate religious information on what to do during a pandemic as far as the Eid is concerned. But since we are just a Muslim community, we do not have, the power to enforce. We could only advise, and this is the result of what we're seeing. But strictly speaking, as far as Islam is concerned, it is unfortunate that some people will have to flout it.
And what is the significance of the Eid al-Fitr for the sake of your neighbors who are not Muslims, just to understand what the celebration is about?
Is the festival, after the completion of 30 days of fasting. It is a thanksgiving. It's, getting together, thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rededicating our lives and playing out the resolution that we have, made after 30 years of fasting. That is why one of the most important things during the celebration is reaching out to the less privileged through what we call Zakat al-Fitr, so that everybody will be happy, fellow feeling, reaching out to others, having empathy, so that no one will go hungry, everyone will feel happy, everyone will feel fulfilled, and this is what is supposed to be, carried over to our everyday life, even after the Eid.
And we wish you happy celebrations, you and all of the Muslim community here in Lagos and around Nigeria. Thank you so much, Imam Abdurrahman Ahmad, for joining us on the News at 10.
Thank you.
In the meantime, more Muslim clerics have been comparing notes on their sit-at-home-to-pray order, which marks this year's Eid al-Fitr celebrations. Some of them who spoke to Channels Television say there's nothing unusual with the directive in some states of the country as regards advice on congregational prayers of worship in order to combat COVID-19. But they argue that this is provided for in the Holy Quran.
No call to worship at this mosque and so many others spread across Lagos State. Elements that usually will make up the celebrations after prayers at the various open prayer grounds are also not permitted this year, especially in Lagos. COVID-19 has altered our way of life and way of living. What can these young lads do? They still managed some celebration closings and kept to their streets. It's the end of the fasting season for the Islamic faithful, regardless of 29 days or 30 days fast, and it is commemorated with the Eid al-Fitr celebrations. And somehow we are not seeing all of the trappings of the celebration. For instance, in the call to prayer, you hear things, for instance, like Ayala Salat. That says, come to the mosque for prayer. That's provided for in the Quran. Then again, if you hear Solu fi buyutikum, an Islamic word, it tells you you can pray in your house, and that is if the conditions do not allow you to come to the mosque. Good morning, sir. Good to see you. Senior Assistant Registrar, Yaba College of Technology, Staff Development and Training, Saeed Salman, tells us it all started in Medina. The essence of the festival, the giving of zakah, which is alms giving, the criteria for celebration, which should be preceded by a fast period, and why this year's variation in prayers isn't any big deal. Hear him.
The ideal is go there, converge there, observe your salats. But in a situation whereby we are talking about life, talking about communicable disease, Islam attaches importance to our life. So in this case, take care of yourself. Don't kill yourself. We are all allowed to observe our salat in our different and respective homes.
Dr. Lukman of the Muslim Congress has no qualms with the directive.
We have actually prepared our mind the last 1 week that in Islamic theology is actually allowed to celebrate Eid al-Fitr with your family within the four walls of your house. And we actually issued so many releases to that effect. There are video clips on how to do it. So people are already mobilized, sensitized on how to go about that.
What an unusual Eid al-Fitr celebration for the year 2020. The solace is that it was foreseen according to the Muslim clerics. And again, these are not normal times. Olu Phillips, Channels Television News.
When the News at 10 returns, mixed reactions still trailing the ban on almajiri as some northern states are yet to comply. We'll be joined by our in-house analyst Babajide Ogusonwo to look at the chances of a timely cure for COVID-19. Please join us again. Welcome back to the news at 10. While Muslims in Kaduna State observe Eid al-Fitr in their homes, Governor Nasir El-Rufai was at the Kaduna-Kano border monitoring lockdown compliance. The governor, who turned many vehicles back, says the intention is to check spread of the coronavirus and reduce the number of cases in the state.
This year's Eid al-Fitr has been met with quiet streets and closed mosques, no thanks to the coronavirus pandemic. This is the first time Muslims in Kaduna State will be celebrating this important event in Islamic calendar in seclusion amid a total lockdown. There is heavy security presence on the roads to ensure no breach of a lockdown during the festivity. Because of the ban on religious gatherings, many families gather to observe the Eid prayer at home.
Since the coming of Islam from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is the first time, so it's unusual and it's challenging, honestly.
This is temporary. It will come and go. Wishing that Allah the Most Exalted come next year for those whom Allah wills to extend their lives. We will do it as the usual thing we used to do in the States and elsewhere in the country.
Meanwhile, Governor Nasir El-Rufai was at the Kaduna-Kano border to monitor the compliance with the ban on interstate travel, especially during the Salah celebration. Accompanied by some government officials, the governor turned away many unauthorized vehicles, while passengers without valid exemption IDs were arrested and handed over to the mobile courts.
We intend to keep at this because we intend to ensure that we restrict the movement of people so that we can contain the disease within Kaduna State. As long as we can contain it, we can then begin to ease the lockdown so that people within Kaduna can be free to live their own lives. Because we don't have the disease in scary numbers in Kaduna. But if we allow people to come in from states where the disease is very, very prevalent, it will raise our rates of infections and it will force the government to extend the lockdown. We don't want to keep people locked down forever.
Health authorities in Kaduna State have said that most of those who tested positive for COVID-19 in the state have a travel history, mainly from Kano State. And they warn that the gains recorded from the enforcement of a lockdown could be eroded by social gatherings at this time.
Staying in Kaduna State, the 7-day warning strike embarked upon by members of the joint health sector unions is taking its toll at most public hospitals in the state. Despite a warning by the state government and a threat of sanctions, the health workers are sticking to their guns, demanding the refund of 25% deductions from their salaries to provide relief for the less privileged.
This is the condition of the Barrow Dikko Teaching Hospital in the Kaduna State capital. No workers and no patients seen around. The 7-day warning strike embarked upon by the Joint Health Workers Union, including medical doctors and nurses, is taking a toll on all the government hospitals across the state. Patients at the Sabon Tasha General Hospital have also deserted their hospital beds as there's nobody around to attend to them. Those coming for the first time to seek medical attention are left stranded by the absence of medical personnel.
I'm here with my wife. She took him and she was operated yesterday before the strike. And unfortunate for us, we came after the operation. They now said they are going on strike and they left us stranded.
The health workers are demanding for the refund of the 25% deduction of their salaries in April and May by the Kaduna State government owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. They're also threatening to proceed on indefinite strike if their demands are not met.
There's already a 21-day ultimatum that has been given for an indefinite strike, which is going to end on the 5th of June. And if by the 5th of June no agreement has been reached and the issues are still lingering, then I guess the unions will have no choice but to embark on an indefinite strike.
In the meantime, the Chief Medical Director of Barrow Dikko Teaching Hospital is appealing to the striking health workers to return, pointing out the consequences of downing tools at this critical time.
The unions are urged
to please sheath their swords and come back to the discussion table so that we can continue discussing with in their terms of look at their grievances and then discuss it and see find an amicable way of resolving the issues.
With medical services paralyzed in the public hospitals, the fate of many patients becomes uncertain as they have the options of self-medicating or turning to private hospitals for proper medical attention.
Here in Lagos, the state government has announced the discharge of 31 more patients from its isolation centres after they tested negative to COVID-19. The patients, which comprised 12 females and 19 males, were discharged from various centres spread across the state. This brings the number of patients discharged in the state to 738. In a statement, the Lagos State Governor, Mr. Babajide Sanwo-Olu, encourages Lagosians to imbibe the culture of cleanliness and adhere to the rules laid down by the National Centre for Disease Control, the NCDC. Despite a decision by the northern governors to ban Almajiri's system of education in the region, there are mixed reactions as some states are yet to comply. In states like Yobe, the government says it will not repatriate Almajiri and would rather take the Quranic education to the doorstep of residents by including the system into Western education.
These children and many of their kinds have left the comfort of their parents at tender age in search of Islamic knowledge in what is popularly known as the Almajiri system of education. To many, it's a duty of every Muslim, while to others, it's a denial of parental responsibility. But besides seeking Islamic knowledge, the young persons must also find other means of subsistence, be it menial laundry services or outright begging for alms for daily survival.
What makes us parents is also to train these children, to educate them, to shelter them, and also to clothe them. If you cannot do this, actually, you cannot call yourself a parent.
The begging is rejected totally in Islam. All of form of begging, bara in Hausa. So this is rejected, has no relevance with the teaching of Islam.
For many of the Almajiri, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced them to abandon this quest in other states, as most of them have been sent back to their home states. Yobe State had so far received over 250 Almajiri deported from Nasarawa, Gombe, and Adamawa states. It's not all gloomy for the Yobe returnees, as the government is building 7 model integrated schools across the major cities in which the Almajiri will join other pupils in acquiring both Quranic and Western education.
Sometimes when you don't have an alternative, then you go to the devil's workshop. In Yobe State here, we will give them the alternatives. We will provide the alternative for them.
But the question remains, how willing are the parents of these children to allow their wards acquire conventional Western education and to cooperate with the government's determination to enroll them into these model schools? The answers will be seen in the days ahead.
The federal government has fined a Flair Jet Aviation Company 1 million naira for disobeying the COVID-19 commercial flights ban rule. The Minister of Aviation, Mr. Hadi Sirika, says the fine was the maximum penalty provided for in the country's civil aviation regulations. He adds that the airline contravened Section 133 of the Nigeria Civil Aviation Regulations 2015 and that their callous misdemeanor has been reported to the United Kingdom Civil Aviation Authority and other British bodies. The federal government had banned international and local flights in the country as part of efforts to control the COVID-19 outbreak and only allowed essential and emergency flights to operate in the airports. According to Mr. Sirika, Flair Jet had applied and received approval from the Ministry of Aviation to carry out humanitarian operations, but was found to be operating commercial flight on May 17th. There are more questions than answers on what drugs are most effective to treat the symptoms of coronavirus. As the world looks to the World Health Organization for an approved vaccine or drug, many countries have decided to save lives using a trial and error approach. Tonight, one of those approaches is to generate controversy is the chloroquine and its derivatives. Sharing an update on the treatment of the coronavirus and progress made in Nigeria in the past 7 days is Channels TV's data consultant, Babajide Ogusonwo. Thank you for joining us tonight. You're not on chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, are you?
For now, I'm not, and it's good news. It's Ramadan, and you know, during Ramadan, Muslims believe that the Quran was revealed during Ramadan. So tonight I would like to reveal some good news and some bad news.
Okay, so what's been the most important metric or indicator about the situation of COVID-19 in Nigeria?
It's the good news is that the numbers of patients that are discharged keeps changing and keeps going higher every day. In the last 1 week, past 7 days, more than 700 patients have been discharged. That is the fact. Late last night, the evidence from the NCDC showed that Lagos was leading at discharge over 600 patients. Tonight, we've seen that number has gone significantly higher. So I'd like us to focus a bit more on the good news, and that is, let's look at the chart of the week. The states with the most discharged patients. And if we look at that, here's what you find. 5 states account for approximately half of all patients that have been discharged. I'm talking about Lagos, Bauchi, Abuja, Borno, and Kano. So 4 states, including the FCT. And the good news is, yes, even though Lagos State is the epicenter of the disease, the facts shows that 99% of those that have been reported to have the coronavirus in Lagos are alive. That's the good news. Now, let's talk a bit about the bad news. 50 million, Amarachi. Now, what is 50 million? 50 million, perhaps, is the number of Nigerians that could be living in fear this year. Let me explain myself a bit more. You know, malaria has some symptoms like high fever, body pains, aches, weakness, headaches. Now, the same symptoms are some of the symptoms of malaria are some of the symptoms that patients with the coronavirus have. And so the right question is, how many Nigerians are estimated that we have information have malaria on an annual basis? And that's the number, 50 million. And so we potentially this year could have as much as 50 million Nigerians that will be living in fear, that will have malaria and might think they have the coronavirus. Why is this number important? It is important that while we fight the disease, the government also creates a plan to fight the fear. Yeah. And that is what we need to do.
And I do remember the UN has also called attention to that other, opportunistic illnesses could also be, ignored because we're all focused on fighting coronavirus. But the reason I asked about whether you were on hydroxychloroquine is because the US President, Donald Trump, as you know, is on hydroxychloroquine. He's taking that as a preventive. Is there any new information from the WHO or from any other global body regarding how to manage the virus?
Hydroxychloroquine is a big topic, so perhaps we should start from one other perspective, which is, what is the WHO recommending as treatment for the coronavirus? And I'd like us to focus on that. Let's take a look at the WHO's own recommendation on how the coronavirus should be managed. And if you look at that recommendation, top 3, here's what you notice. The first is the WHO says that there's no medicine that has been shown to prevent or cure the disease. Yeah. That's from the WHO.
There's no one medicine.
No one medicine. The second is the WHO says there are currently no drugs licensed for the treatment or prevention of COVID-19.
Because we're treating symptoms.
Because we're treating symptoms. And finally, the WHO says it's coordinating efforts to develop vaccines and medications for the coronavirus. I'd like to summarize it in 3 ways. The first is, yes, the WHO is saying that we should not use hydroxychloroquine, but the WHO is not saying what people should use. That's the first.
They're not giving alternatives then.
The second is, unlicensed drugs are working. Over 2,000 patients have been discharged in Nigeria. Many more thousands of patients have been discharged. And if the WHO says there are no licensed drugs and patients are being discharged, it means that the unlicensed drugs or the unlicensed therapy that is being treating symptoms are working. Now, finally, there could be a bigger pandemic. There currently is a war between those that are trying to produce a vaccine and those that are trying to produce a cure. Those that are trying to produce the vaccine are looking at the potential 7.5 billion people. And so there's a lot of politics even in the WHO. Remember, when the WHO was founded in 1948, 0% of its donations came from voluntary donors. Right now, 70% of the World Health Organization's funding comes from voluntary donors, and a lot of politics
doing so well
are involved.
You got to the bad news again. Thanks again for joining us on
What will be the most important message in the second half of the year? I'll share that with you next week.
We need to go on a break. Still ahead on the news at 10, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces trial for alleged bribery, fraud and breach of trust days after he began a new term in office. Stay with us. Welcome back to the news at 10. Southeast governors are asking Igbos living within and outside the region to adhere strictly to the ban on interstate movement and other safety guidelines. After a closed-door meeting of the governors at Enugu State Government House, the chairman of the forum and governor of Ebonyi State, Dave Umahi, spoke on the decisions reached by the governors. The governors say they will not implement recent communication on community policing by the Inspector General of Police, as it does not reflect the initial agreement reached when he met with them in Enugu State.
The forum directed that all Igbos living outside Igbo lands and within Igbo land do obey all extant COVID-19 orders, namely Presidential Directive on Interstate Movement, WHO, NCDC hygiene protocols, Presidential Task Force and Directive of Southeast Governors, and Directive of all governors where they live. On community policing, the recent communication from the Inspector General of Police to our governors of Southeast on community policing composition is not in keeping with the agreement we reached with him during his last visit to the Southeast. In the circumstance, we cannot begin implementation of it until the program reflects our earlier agreement with the IGP. The Southeast governors and their leaders request the IGP to please revert to our initial agreement reached on community policing.
Away now to the foreign scene, the trial of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on corruption charges has begun in Jerusalem. Mr. Netanyahu, who is the first standing leader to face trial in the country's history, denies accusations of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. When he arrived at the courthouse for a brief hearing, he said the cases were aimed at toppling him in any way possible. The Prime Minister was sworn back into office as head of a rare unity government a week ago. His political rival, Benny Gantz, agreed to share power after three inconclusive elections in under a year. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has defended the action of his most senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, following allegations he violated his quarantine. Mr. Cummings had made a trip to Bernard Castle, 30 miles away from where he was supposed to be self-isolating in Durham. The UK Prime Minister has faced calls from within his own Conservative Party for Cummings to resign for travelling 400 kilometres during the lockdown. But the Prime Minister says he had acted responsibly and legally in every respect, that his aide made the journey to ensure his 4-year-old son could be properly cared for by relatives if he fell too ill. The journey took place at a time when millions of Britons were staying inside and foregoing contacts with friends and relatives. In Brazil, President Jair Bolsonaro today greeted anti-lockdown protesters after his country passed 340,000 cases of COVID-19 and Brazil took the world's #2 hotspot for coronavirus cases. In a video supplied by his office, Bolsonaro was seen arriving at Ministry's Esplanade in Brasilia, the Brazilian capital, wearing a face mask, which he later removed as he mixed with his supporters. China says it has no geopolitical intentions when assisting countries during the coronavirus pandemic and calls on the United States to work with China and save lives. The call was made by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi during a televised news conference. Tensions between Beijing and Washington have flared since the outbreak, with President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping repeatedly trading bombs over issues related to the pandemic. Meanwhile, preparations are underway at airports across India as airlines ready themselves to resume flight operations, even as positive cases of coronavirus continue to rise. After a 2-month coronavirus shutdown, India's airlines will now be allowed to resume flights with about a third of operations from Monday, May 25th, but on domestic routes only and with rules that are among the strictest in the world. Muslims across the Middle East are experiencing an unprecedented Eid al-Fitr, where some of the region's major cities, usually overflowing with people, are now deserted under government-imposed lockdowns aimed at curbing the spread of coronavirus. And in the United States, many Americans took advantage of states reopening to enjoy Memorial Day weekend on beaches, despite death toll from the coronavirus inches away from the 100,000 mark. Sports is now in the German Bundesliga. Timo Werner hit a hat-trick as Red Bull Leipzig beat Mainz 5-0 in the Bundesliga match day 27 tie played earlier today at the Opel Arena. Leipzig were chasing a win to move up to third place in the pursuit of the Champions League spots, while Mainz needed a win to avoid being dragged towards the relegation spots. Werner, who scored 3 goals in November's 8-0 thrashing of Mainz, set Leipzig on their way inside 11 minutes, slotting home his 22nd league goal of the season from Konrad Lemmer's brilliant cross. Late headers by substitute Anthony Modeste and John Cordoba allowed Cologne to salvage a 2-2 home draw against Fortuna Düsseldorf after Mark Uth had missed a penalty for the hosts. Meanwhile, Augsburg have ended their poor run to stun Schalke 04 3-0 away. The win moves Augsburg to 12th position on 30 points, 7 points away from the relegation playoff spot in the league table. And just before we close the bulletin, Lagos residents may have to brace up for a tough few months as the state government has announced the partial closure of the Marine Beach Bridge, situated in the Apapa axis, for 5 months, effective from Wednesday, May 27th, to Wednesday, the 21st of October 2020. This is to allow for repair work on the bridge. In a statement issued today by the Commissioner for Transportation, Dr. Frederick Oladende, the planned repairs on the bridge by the Federal Ministry of Works is vital to the safety of the people of Lagos, especially motorists plying the route to access different parts of the state. The Commissioner further explained that the necessary repair works have already been carried out on all alternative routes around the construction site, making them motorable to ease motorists' movement during the construction period. And the main news again, Muslims around the world today held a low-key Eid al-Fitr celebration to mark the end of 30 days fasting period of Ramadan amid the coronavirus pandemic. Also today, President Muhammadu Buhari held Eid al-Fitr prayers at home with his family. The president asked Nigerian farmers to scale up production for food sufficiency in the absence of importation. That's the news at 10 tonight. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Good night.